Forget everything you think you know about ancient Earth. Long before the first dinosaur ever left a footprint, our planet was a completely different world, running on rules that would feel completely alien to us today. We are not talking about a few million years here or there, but about a span of time so vast it almost breaks the human brain. To imagine it, more than 4 billion years of history, most of which unfolded in an ocean, with no trees on land, no birds in the sky, and no sound except the slow crash of waves over barren rock. This was a planet dominated not by giants walking on continents, but by bizarre, otherworldly life, drifting, crawling, and hunting in a global ocean that wrapped almost entirely around the globe. If you were to stand on some hypothetical shore back then and look out at that water, you would have had no idea that beneath the surface, in the dim blue light, the very first chapters of all future life, dinosaurs, mammals, humans were already being written. For almost all of Earth's history, this ocean was the planet's laboratory, running a slow, relentless series of evolutionary experiments with no script, no direction, and no guarantee of success. Inside it, simple chemistry gradually transformed into complex biology, and what started as a thin haze of molecules dissolved in water eventually turned into the ancestors of every creature that has ever lived. The predators that would one day rule these seas had no concept of future, but every tiny mutation, every small advantage pushed life one step closer to the intricate ecosystems we recognize today. If our familiar age of dinosaurs feels epic, understand this. It is only a very late chapter in a book that began in a dark ocean under a toxic sky, long before any dinosaur tree or flowering plant existed. In this video, we are going to peel back those older chapters and walk through some of the strangest, least talked about ages in Earth's story. The invisible reign of microbes, the quiet alien gardens of the Ediacaran, and the sudden explosive chaos of the Cambrian seas. You're going to meet creatures that look like living quilts, armored tanks with crystal eyes, nightmares with spiked tentacles, and apex predators that swam through the water like guided missiles more than 500 million years ago. By the end, when you think of prehistoric monsters, you might not picture dinosaurs at all. You might think of the deep, ancient oceans and the experimental life that filled them. If you'd like to hear to more such interesting documentaries, subscribe and like this video. And do let us know in the comments from which part of the world are you watching this video, and what is the time there. We want to see how far across space and time this little community. Now let's roll the clock all the way back, past the dinosaurs, past the first forests, past even the first animals, to a time when life itself was almost an afterthought on a violent, unstable world. If you could travel back to the very beginning of Earth, you would not recognize it as home. The early planet was still cooling from its birth, in a cosmic collision of dust and rock, its surface hammered by constant asteroid impacts, its thin crust cracking and reforming as oceans of magma shifted below. There were no continents, like the ones we know today, just fragmented slabs of rock poking above steaming mineral-rich seas. The sky was a choking mix of gases, carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, water vapor, and almost no free oxygen at all. To a modern human, one breath of that air would be fatal. But for what was about to happen next, it was the perfect starting point. At this stage, there were no animals, no plants, and no ecosystems, at least not in the way we use those words. What existed instead was chemistry simple molecules colliding, reacting, and sometimes forming more complex chains in the cracks of rocks around volcanic vents and in shallow, sunlit pools. Over unimaginable stretches of time, some of those chains became stable enough to store information. Others learned how to copy themselves with just enough accuracy to persist, but with just enough error to evolve. Somewhere in that chemical chaos, perhaps around 4 billion years ago, the first true cells appeared, tiny bubbles of fat and protein floating in the water, guarding delicate strands of genetic code. They were not animals, not plants, not even what we would call bacteria today, but they were alive, and they were the ancestors of everything that followed. For hundreds of millions of years, this was life, microscopic, single-celled, and invisible to any naked eye that would ever evolve in the future. If you scooped up a handful of seawater back then, you might have seen nothing at all. Yet, inside that drop could have been an entire universe of cells, dividing, mutating, dying, and adapting. No creature hunted another. There were no teeth, no shells, no bones. Energy flowed through simple chemical reactions powered by heat from the Earth and faint sunlight from above. And in this quiet, unseen world, something happened that would completely rewrite the planet's destiny. Some of these microscopic pioneers discovered a way to eat sunlight. Our story truly begins with these tiny, almost ghost-like organisms that would go on to remodel the entire planet without ever building a single skyscraper, city, or machine. For billions of years, the oceans were a kind of dull chemical soup, rich in dissolved minerals and gases, but poor in oxygen, sloshing beneath a harsh sky filled with volcanic fumes. To us, it would have looked dead. But down in that murky water, the first real architects of Earth's future were quietly at work, single-celled microbes experimenting with new ways to survive. Among these early life forms, some lineages eventually evolved into what we now call cyanobacteria, tiny blue-green cells that unlocked one of the most powerful tricks in the history of life, photosynthesis. Using only sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide, they could build their own food, turning raw chemistry into living matter. As a byproduct, they released a gas that at the time was basically a form of pollution waste. They had no use for oxygen. Today, that same oxygen is what fills your lungs with every breath and fuels your brain as you watch this video. But when it first started building up, it was toxic to many of the organisms that had evolved in an oxygen-free world. Cyanobacteria did not simply drift aimlessly through the water. Over time, they grouped together into thick, slimy communities called microbial mats, spreading across shallow seafloors, coastlines, and tidal flats like living carpets. These mats trapped tiny grains of sand and silt layer after layer, year after year. As the microbes grew upward toward the light, they left behind bands of trapped sediment forming strange layered rock structures called stromatolites, towering lumpy domes that could grow as tall as a person over thousands of years. If you had walked through a shallow lagoon 3 billion years ago, you might have seen these knobbly, dome-like mounds, breaking the surface, looking like boulders, even though they were alive on the outside. These stromatolites were more than just weird geological features. They were the first reefs, well before coral ever existed. They shaped coastlines, provided tiny homes and surfaces for other microbes to cling to, and turned parts of the ocean floor into bustling microscopic cities. While each cell was absurdly simple compared to any animal together, They formed ecosystems with chemical gradients, food chains, and competition for space and light. And as they spread, they kept pumping out more and more oxygen, slowly changing the chemistry of the entire planet. At first, most of this oxygen did not reach the air at all. Instead, it reacted with vast amounts of dissolved iron in the oceans, rusting it out of the water and depositing it on the seafloor as bands of iron-rich rock. These banded iron formations, still mined today, are some of the clearest fingerprints of this ancient microbial activity. Layer upon layer of iron oxide settled out of the water, painting a record of oxygen's early rise across the seafloor. Only after the ocean's iron sponge filled up did oxygen finally begin to spill into the atmosphere, first in tiny amounts, then in a more dramatic surge, sometimes called the Great Oxygenation Event. For many of the early microbes that had evolved to live without oxygen, this new gas was catastrophic. Oxygen is highly reactive. It can damage delicate biological molecules, and for organisms not prepared to handle it, it was lethal. Entire groups of anaerobic microbes were pushed into isolated pockets. Deep sediments, oxygen, poor lakes, and underground environments, while lineages that could tolerate or even use oxygen began to thrive. Life itself was split into new branches, ones that embraced this reactive molecule and ones that retreated from it. But for the planet as a whole, oxygen was a game changer. It enabled far more efficient ways of extracting energy from food, making it possible for cells to grow larger, more complex, and eventually to work together as multicellular organisms. The invisible architects, those seemingly insignificant cyanobacteria and their microbial neighbor, had laid the groundwork for every complex breath that would ever be taken. By slowly raising oxygen levels in the oceans and atmosphere, they set the stage for the rise of animals, plants, and the entire tapestry of complex life. To appreciate how long their reign lasted, consider this. For most of Earth's history, this was it. Life began diversified and transformed the environment almost entirely at the microbial scale. No eyes stared out across the water. No jaws snapped shut around fleeing prey. No limbs crawled along the ocean floor. For billions of years, the most advanced ecosystem engineers on Earth were microscopic mats of bacteria, quietly building reefs that dwarfed modern coral structures and exhaling the oxygen that would one day let a future human inhale. And that is where our journey truly launches, from a silent world ruled by invisible architects to an ocean that is about to blossom into something far stranger and more dramatic. The oxygen they released did not just make the air breathable, it helped fuel the rise of complex multicellular organisms that would turn the seafloor into an alien garden and eventually into a battlefield full of monstrous predators. In the next part of this story, we will watch that transformation unfold as we step into the Ediacaran seas and then into the chaos of the Cambrian Explosion, where life goes from soft quilted mats to armored tanks and nightmare hunters in what feels like the blink of a geological eye. After billions of years of microscopic rule, when life on Earth was mostly a film of invisible cells clinging to rocks and drifting through the water, the planet's story took a dramatic and terrifying turn. Without warning, in geological terms, ice advanced from the poles and crept toward the equator, until, according to many scientists, even the tropics froze. The oceans that had once been open and storm-tossed were sealed beneath thick, grinding sheets of ice mountain ranges, vanished under white-capped sunlight that once reached shallow seas, now bounced off a planet that had turned into a giant snowball in space. This is what we call Snowball Earth, a time when our world came dangerously close to becoming a permanent ice planet, and when life faced one of its earliest and greatest challenges. If you could stand on the surface, then somewhere along a jagged coastline, now locked under ice, you would see almost nothing that looked alive. The air would be thin and brutally cold. The horizon, a hard, glittering line of white and blue. And the seas beneath your feet would be dark, cold tombs for most surface life forms. But life has always refused to go quietly. Even as glaciers spread and temperatures plummeted, tiny pockets of water remained unfrozen cracks in the ice regions near underwater volcanic vents, patches of open water near the equator, and thin films of liquid brine beneath the frozen crust. In these hidden refuges, microbial communities clung to existence, waiting out an ice age that may have lasted tens of millions of years. It is hard to overstate how close Earth may have come to losing its biosphere altogether during these episodes. If the planet had frozen just a bit more deeply, or if volcanic outgassing had slowed, there might not have been enough greenhouse gases in the air to ever thaw the ice. No plants, no animals, no humans, just a silent, frozen sphere orbiting the sun. But deep within the crust, massive volcanic eruptions continued to belch carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere, even as the surface remained locked in ice. Because the icy surface reflected so much sunlight, it took an enormous buildup of greenhouse gases before the balance finally tipped and the planet slowly began to warm. As temperatures inched upward, the ice sheets thinned, fractured, and finally began to collapse. Paleoclimatologists think that when this global deep freeze ended, it may have done so in a series of catastrophic melt events. Glaciers retreated, sea levels surged, and gigantic floods of glacial meltwater poured into the oceans. The sudden influx of fresh water, combined with the greenhouse atmosphere, likely drove intense storms and hurricanes unlike anything we experience today. Imagine towering walls of ice carving into dark water, sending tsunamis racing across half-frozen seas, while a carbon dioxide-rich sky trapped more and more heat below. It was chaotic, violent, and transformative. By around 635 million years ago, the last of these Snowball Earth episodes had finally released its grip. The ice retreated, exposing once buried coastlines, and the oceans, now bathed again in sunlight, were left with a very different chemical makeup than before the freeze. Thanks to the work of photosynthetic microbes, over billions of years, the seas and atmosphere contained much more oxygen than they once had. Glacial grinding had pulverized continental rocks into fine sediments rich in nutrients like phosphorus and iron, which washed into the newly opened seas. The result was a world primed for something Newman, evolutionary stage like nothing Earth had ever seen. Welcome to the Ediacaran period, the last stretch of the Precambrian, and the calm before the storm of the Cambrian Explosion. If the earlier microbial world was a realm of invisible architects, the Ediacaran seas were an art gallery of strange, fragile sculptures laid out across the seafloor. For the first time in Earth's history, life was big enough to see without a microscope. Soft, sometimes meat, long organisms patterned with ridges, fronds, and quilted segments. But if you were imagining fish crabs or jellyfish, erase that picture. These organisms looked like nothing alive today. and scientists are still arguing about what exactly they were. Picture yourself floating in the dim, quiet waters of an Ediacaran sea. Above you, there is no reef of branching corals, no schools of fish, no sharks cutting through the blue. Instead, the seafloor below is covered in a low, almost carpet-like community of organisms, each one more puzzling than the last. Some lie flat like patterned doormats, others stand upright like fronds of seaweed, but with no clear stems or roots. Still others form clusters of lobed discs overlapping like stacks of soft living coins. The water is relatively still, the light faint, and the entire scene feels more like walking through a garden of living fabrics than visiting any modern reef. One of the strangest residents of this alien garden was Dickinsonia, a creature that looked a bit like a segmented oval mattress pressed into the mud. Its body was made up of repeated rib-like units radiating from a central line, giving it a quilted appearance, as if it had been stitched together from identical pieces. Some individuals were only a few centimeters long. Others grew to more than a meter, sprawling across the seafloor like living bath mats. We do not see anything quite like Dickinsonia in modern oceans, and paleontologists are still debating whether it should be considered an early animal, a kind of experimental, multicellular organism, or part of its own no-extinct branch of life. Recent chemical evidence suggests it might have been an early animal that absorbed nutrients from the microbial mats beneath it, gliding slowly over the surface like a living vacuum cleaner. But the debate is far from over. Standing tall above some parts of the Ediacaran seafloor were delicate fern-like creatures known as Charnia. These organisms anchored themselves in soft sediment and sent up fronded bodies patterned with rows of tiny leaf-shaped units. They did not have obvious mouths, stomachs, or any internal organs we would recognize. Instead, they may have absorbed dissolved nutrients directly from the water, or possibly captured microscopic particles with their broad surfaces. In the dim, deeper waters, where sunlight could barely reach whole groves of Charnia, might have swayed slowly back and forth in unseen currents, like rows of ghostly plants in a twilight garden. What makes the Ediacaran biota so alien is not just how they looked, but how they lived. Most of the known organisms from this time appear to have been sessile, meaning they stayed attached to one spot on the seafloor, or at best moved very slowly. There is little evidence for jaws, claws, or hard shells. Instead of chasing, biting, and devouring each other, these early communities seem to have been powered by gentle flows of nutrients, dissolved organic matter, drifting past microbial mats spread across the sediment, and perhaps symbiotic relationships with photosynthetic or chemosynthetic microbes. In other words, this was a world almost entirely without predation, a planet before the invention of the hunter. Imagine an ecosystem where nothing runs and nothing truly flees. The Ediacaran seafloor would have been eerily quiet compared to modern reefs. No sudden dashes from lurking predators, no explosions of fish scattering in all directions, no frenzied feeding frenzies. Instead, the drama played out on slower time scales. Which organism could grow taller to intercept more flow? Which could spread wider across the sediment? Which could colonize freshly opened patches of seafloor? After a storm event or a change in currents, the fossils of the Ediacaran period are extraordinarily delicate impressions preserved in fine sediments, often found as faint outlines on slabs of sandstone and siltstone. Paleontologists study them under raking light and with 3D scans to tease out details of their anatomy. Some species, like Spragina, have segmented bodies that led early researchers to wonder if they might be ancestors of worms or arthropods. Others, like Fractofusus, spread out in fractal branching patterns that seem more like mathematical shapes than living creatures. Every new Ediacaran fossil bed adds more strange forms to the roster and raises more questions about how life experimented with body plans before settling on the familiar ones we know today. One of the big mysteries of the Ediacaran world is exactly where these organisms fit on the tree of life. Some may indeed be early animals, related in broad strokes to groups like Cnidarians, the group that includes jellyfish and corals, or even the ancestors of bilaterians animals, with left and right symmetry like us. Others might represent evolutionary dead-ends lineages that tried out multicellularity in ways that worked for a while, but were ultimately outcompeted or wiped out. The truth is that the Ediacaran period was a time of experimentation on a planetary scale. Life had unlocked multicellularity and large body size, but it had not yet settled into the familiar roles of predator and prey grazer and plant swimmer and crawler. The rules were still being written. The environment of the late Precambrian likely helped drive this burst of weirdness. With higher oxygen levels and nutrient-rich oceans following Snowball Earth, it became possible for organisms to grow thicker, taller, and more structurally complex than ever before. But with no major predators to keep their numbers in check, and no arms race pushing for speed or armor, these early multicellular organisms could afford to be soft, slow, and strange. It was a world where being a stationary quilted pancake on the seafloor was a viable, long-term strategy. Yet even in this quiet garden, times were changing. Microbial mats that had once blanketed the seafloor began to be disturbed in new ways, perhaps by early burrowing organisms carving channels in the sediment. Trace fossils, simple grooves, tubes, and trackways hint that some animals were beginning to move more actively across or within the mud, nibbling on the microbial layer and leaving the first signs of behavior etched into the rock record. These early burrowers and grazers may have started to break up the stable mat-covered environment that Ediacaran organisms relied on, setting the stage for ecological upheaval. In addition, environmental conditions likely continued to fluctuate. Shifts in sea level chemistry and temperature would have created cycles of expansion and contraction for different communities, rewarding flexibility and innovation. Organisms that could adapt to slightly deeper or shallower waters, or that could colonize new types of sediment, would have had an edge. Slowly, pressures were building for more active lifestyles, better ways to grab food, move through the water, or protect oneself from being eaten. Once eating other large organisms became a thing. For millions of years, though, the Ediacaran seas kept their dreamlike quality. Broad, flat organisms spread like living tapestries. Upright fronds formed forests on the seafloor. Disc-shaped creatures dotted the sediment like coins scattered from a giant's purse. If you could drift above them, watching the slow sway of fronds and the gentle undulation of soft tissues, you might be forgiven for thinking this was the endpoint of evolution, rather than just a preliminary sketch. But just beyond the horizon, evolution was preparing a radical plot twist. Because as alien as these creatures seem, they were not the final word on complex life. They were a first draft, an experiment in building larger, more intricate organisms in a world that still did not know what a predator was. When that concept finally arrived, when some lineage evolved the ability to actively hunt and consume other large organisms, the entire structure of Earth's ecosystems would be torn up and rebuilt. And many of the gentle, quilted beings of the Ediacaran would not survive the transition. From our vantage point, looking back across more than 500 million years, the Ediacaran period sits at a crossroads. Behind it lies the nearly invisible realm of microbial mats and stromatolites, stretching back billions of years into the deep Precambrian. Ahead of it lies the Cambrian Explosion, a riot of hard shell's teeth, claws, and complex body plans that form the roots of almost every major animal group alive today. The Ediacaran ocean floor, soft, quiet, and full of beings that look like living quilt and fronds, is the bridge between these two worlds. We are going to follow that bridge in the next segment, stepping from this weird fabric-like world into the explosive diversity of the Cambrian seas, where trilobites, hallucination, worthy worms, and apex predators, like Anomalocaris, surge onto the evolutionary stage. Then, around 541 million years ago, the ocean changed character in a way that is almost hard to imagine. For billions of years, life had crept forward at a slow, careful pace. Small improvements here, a new way of feeding there, gentle experiments that played out over vast stretches of time. The Ediacaran seas had been soft and quiet, filled with motionless fronds and quilted ovals, resting on microbial mats, a world of drifting nutrients, and almost no violence. But beneath that calm surface, oxygen levels were rising, ecosystems were becoming more layered, and tiny changes were building up in the genomes of countless organisms. In what geologists call a blink of time, still millions of years, but fast on a planetary scale, life took those accumulated possibilities and unfolded them all at once. We call this moment the Cambrian Explosion. In the rock record, it appears as a sudden surge of diversity, new shapes, new body plans, new ways of moving, feeding, and protecting. Almost every major animal blueprint that exists today, creatures with heads and tails, with legs and antennae, with shells and claws, and segmented bodies, makes its first clear appearance during this interval. It is not that life suddenly sprang from nowhere. Rather, it is as if the evolutionary camera finally gained enough resolution for us to see the details clearly. For the first time, the ocean hosts communities that would start to look in silhouette, at least strangely familiar to us. Scientists still debate exactly why the Cambrian explosion happened when it did. Several gentle, overlapping changes probably set the stage. Oxygen in the oceans rose to levels that could support more active, energy-hungry animals. Nutrient cycles reshaped by erosion, volcanoes, and microbial life may have allowed food to be more abundant and more evenly spread. Genetic innovations such as flexible developmental toolkits gave organisms the ability to experiment with new forms, more easily adding segments, growing limbs, rearranging body parts in ways that could be tested by natural selection. Among all these factors, one simple innovation stands out in many explanations: the evolution of vision. Before eyes, most interactions between organisms were guided by touch and chemistry. You could sense light and dark perhaps, or detect the presence of a neighbor through molecules in the water, but you could not pick out a shape from a distance track, a moving target, or spot a safe hiding place across the seafloor. With the first image forming eyes that changed. Now an animal could see a potential meal approaching, or a predator lurking in the gloom, and respond before contact was made. That simple ability to look around and react turned the ocean from a quiet garden into a place where information awareness and speed mattered. Once some animals could see natural selection began to reward anything that improved either hunting or escaping. A slightly stronger shell, a smoother swimming stroke, a darker body color that blended into the seabed, or a more sensitive eye with additional lenses could all mean the difference between living and becoming someone else's meal. Over millions of years, these small advantages accumulated, leading to a genuine arms race. Prey evolved armor spines and burrowing behaviors. Predators answered with grasping limbs, sharper mouthparts, and more sophisticated sensory systems. The Cambrian seas did not become chaotic overnight, but they did become busier, more layered and more dynamic than anything that had existed before. One of the most successful groups to arise in this new world was the arthropods. Arthropods are animals with jointed limbs and hard outer skeletons, a design so effective that their descendants today include insects, spiders, crabs, and lobsters. In the Cambrian, arthropods explored this blueprint in a dizzying variety of forms. Some crawled along the seafloor, others swam through open water, still others dug into the mud or clung to elevated surfaces. Their stiff, segmented shells provided both protection and a framework for powerful muscles, while their jointed legs and antennae gave them flexibility in how they moved and sensed the world. Among these early arthropods, trilobites were especially abundant and diverse. Picture them as low oval creatures with ridged segmented bodies and a tough exoskeleton that could roll up for protection a bit like a modern pill bug. Some species were only a few millimeters long, while others reached lengths of over 60 centimeters, making them some of the larger animals of their time. Their heads often carried pairs of compound eyes, clusters of tiny lenses arranged together, each contributing a small piece of the overall image. These were some of the earliest sophisticated visual systems in the animal kingdom. Trilobites lived in many ways. Some grazed slowly over the seafloor, feeding on organic particles and microbial films. Others may have been scavengers, cleaning up the remains of larger animals. A few were likely active hunters of small, soft-bodied prey. Their fossils are so common and varied that paleontologists use them to help date rock layers around the world, tracking the rise and fall of species through Cambrian and later periods. In life, they would have formed colorful shifting carpets along the bottom, moving in groups, molting their shells and leaving trails through the sediment. The Cambrian did not just produce familiar, sensible designs, though. It also gave rise to creatures that look to our eyes almost dreamlike. One of the best examples is Hallucigenia, a small worm-like animal whose fossil was so confusing that scientists originally reconstructed it upside down. In early illustrations, Hallucigenia walked on what looked like long, slender spikes with soft tentacles waving above it. Later research showed that the legs were actually flexible, soft appendages, and the spikes were defensive structures on its back. Even reconstructed correctly, though it still looks otherworldly, a narrow tube of a body carried on pairs of stubby legs, each with small claws at the tip, topped by a row of stiff spines reaching upward like a comb. Hallucigenia likely lived close to the seafloor, using its legs to move slowly across the sediment. Its spines would have made it a difficult bite for predators, perhaps discouraging attacks or forcing would-be hunters to look for easier targets. It belonged to a broader group of animals, related to modern velvet worms and arthropods, part of the ongoing experimentation around what a segmented legged body could do. In the calm half-light of Cambrian waters, a small cluster of these animals inching along a microbial film would have looked strange, but not frightening. One more thread in the tapestry of new life being woven across the seafloor. While these smaller creatures explored new ways of living near the sediment, other animals began to dominate the midwater column, the open space above the bottom. Among them, one hunter stands out in the fossil record, Ediacaran, whose name means unusual shrimp. This animal could reach lengths of up to about 2 feet, making it large for its time, and it moved through the water with a series of lateral lobes along its body, undulating gently in coordinated waves. Its head carried 2 large stalked compound eyes, giving it a wide field of view and good depth perception. In front of its mouth, Ediacaran had a pair of flexible, segmented appendages, lined with spines which it could curl inward to grasp and bring prey toward a circular toothed opening. Despite that description, it is important to keep in mind the overall pace of life in these seas. Even the top predators were not roaring monsters. They moved through the water with smooth, efficient motions, their lobes rising and falling in quiet rhythms. A trilobite, or soft-bodied animal on the seafloor, might feel only a change in the current as Ediacaran passed overhead, its shadow drifting silently across the sediment. When it hunted, it likely accelerated in a smooth glide rather than in a sudden lunge, folding its spined arms around softer prey and guiding them inward with an almost mechanical precision. In the calm, filtered light of the Cambrian Ocean, this would have looked more like a slow, inevitable approach than a jump scare. The presence of animals like Ediacaran had deep consequences for the rest of the ecosystem. Any creature that was easy to spot, easy to catch, and easy to eat faced strong pressure to change or disappear. Some lineages responded by evolving thicker shells and more mineralized exoskeletons. Others developed spines, ridges, and complex shapes that made them harder to grab or swallow. Still others altered their behavior, burrowing deeper into the sediment, swimming higher into the water column, or becoming more active at times of day when predators saw less clearly. Over time, these shifts reshaped not just individual species, but entire communities and seafloor landscapes. As the Cambrian progressed, more and more animal groups appeared in the fossil record, early relatives of modern worms, mollusks, and chordates, the broad group that includes vertebrates like us, all make their debut or become more obvious in these layers of rock. Some had simple tube-like bodies, adapted for burrowing and filtering food from the sediment. Others crawled or swam, sifting water for tiny particles or grazing on microbial mats. A few of the earliest chordates, such as small fish-like animals with notochords and muscle blocks, hint at the distant future evolution of more complex vertebrates. But in the Cambrian context, they were just one more modest experiment in a sea full of new ideas. The bottom itself changed character under this new wave of activity. In Ediacaran times, microbial mats often formed continuous blankets over the sediment, anchoring soft-bodied organisms and stabilizing the surface. In the Cambrian, those mats were disrupted more and more frequently by burrowing animals and active grazers. They churned the top layers of the seafloor, mixing oxygen into the sediment and altering the way nutrients were stored and released. This process, known as bioturbation, left characteristic traces, tubes, burrows, and complex feeding structures preserved in cross-section in the rock. The seafloor became softer, more irregular, and more dynamic, a living substrate rather than a smooth microbial carpet. From a distance, a Cambrian reef or seafloor community would have looked calm, almost meditative. The water above would filter sunlight into gentle shafts, illuminating drifting particles and the slow movements of swimming animals. Trilobites would creep steadily over the sediment. Small worms would thread their way in and out of burrows, and soft-bodied creatures would sway with the current. Here and there, a larger predator might pass a shadow gliding through the blue before disappearing again into the dimmer depths. There would be no sudden noises, no flashing colors, just the continuous low-energy rhythms of an ocean that had become more complex, but was still governed by the physics of water and the quiet patience of deep time. If you trace almost any animal alive today back through its evolutionary history, its story passes through the Cambrian in some way. The basic body plan of arthropods, refined over hundreds of millions of years, remains visible in crabs, spiders, and insects. The early chordates hint at the eventual rise of fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Even the idea of a complex, multi-layered ecosystem, where the shape of one species influences the destiny of another, has roots in this time. The Cambrian built a foundation that later ages would remodel, but never completely replace. As we move forward in time from the Cambrian into later periods that flow, will accelerate and elaborate. Coral reefs will become more intricate. Fish will take to the water with stronger muscles and more efficient fins. Some lineages will even begin to test the edges of the ocean, pushing onto damp shorelines and shallow lagoons. But the core logic of animal life in the sea, the logic of sensing, moving, feeding, and reacting, was largely written in this early chapter. The craziness did not stop with the Cambrian. Once life had discovered hard skeletons, complex eyes, and active hunting, the ocean could never truly return to the quiet quilt gardens of the Ediacaran. Instead, across the next chapter of deep time, those early experiments were refined, scaled up, and woven into even richer ecosystems. The Cambrian had introduced the idea of predators and armored prey. The Ordovician world that followed would take those ideas and turn them into something far grander, more crowded, and in many ways more beautiful. When we step into the Ordovician period, starting around 485 million years ago, we are not arriving in a reset world. The Cambrian animals did not suddenly vanish, rather, their descendants continued to evolve and spread. What changed was the scale. In a span of tens of millions of years, the number of marine genera increased dramatically, roughly quadrupling, which means that the tree of life in the oceans suddenly grew many more branches and finer twigs. To picture this, imagine a sparse coral garden turning into a dense, multi-layered rainforest of forms. Only here, almost all of it is underwater, and most of the players have exoskeletons. One of the most important developments of this time was the rise of true coral reefs. In the Cambrian, reef-like structures existed, but in the Ordovician, they matured into complex three-dimensional habitats built by corals and sponges. These early reefs were not identical to the tropical coral reefs we know today, but they played a similar ecological role. They created nooks and crannies, shaded overhangs, and sunlit ledges, and a rich mosaic of microhabitats that could be occupied by different species. The effect on biodiversity was profound. Where flat seafloors had once dominated, now vertical relief allowed for stacking of life like multiple stories in an apartment building. If you could drift gently above an Ordovician reef, you would see a living structure rising from the seafloor, built over generations as coral-like organisms secreted calcium carbonate skeletons. Sponges of various shapes would fill gaps and overhangs, some branching upward, others forming barrels and domes. Bryozoans, tiny colonial animals, would spread lacy sheets over hard surfaces, while brachiopods, clam-like creatures with two shells, anchored themselves with stalks filtering food from the water. Crinoids, relatives of modern sea lilies, would extend feathery arms into the current, their long stems swaying gently as they trapped passing particles. The reef would feel alive in every direction, its surfaces crowded with organisms adapted to tiny differences in light flow and shelter. Trilobites, the armored tanks of the Cambrian, were still very much present in this new age. They had diversified into countless forms, some broad and flat, hugging the sediment, others with tall spines and elaborate ornamentation, still others tiny and streamlined. They walked along the reef slopes, sifted through sediment in nearby basins, and in some cases may have even swum short distances above the bottom. Their compound eyes watched for movement and changes in light, scanning for food and for danger. In Ordovician seas, trilobites remained an important thread in the tapestry of life, both as grazers and as prey. But they were no longer alone at the top of the invertebrate world. A new group of hunters had risen to challenge them, taking full advantage of the open water and the three-dimensional structure of reefs, the cephalopods. These animals, ancient relatives of modern squids, octopuses and cuttlefish, had already appeared in the Cambrian in small, simple forms. During the Ordovician, they expanded into an impressive array of species, many with long, straight external shells called orthocones. Inside those shells, the animal's soft body occupied the front chambers, while the rear chambers were filled with gas and fluid that helped control buoyancy. Among these cephalopods, some species like the giant Camerotteras achieved truly impressive sizes, with estimates suggesting lengths over 6 meters. In the context of early Palaeozoic seas, that made them towering presences, especially compared to the smaller trilobites and brachiopods dotting the seafloor. Hanging in the water column, or gliding slowly along, they would have pointed their shells forward, like long, tapering spears. At the open end, a ring of muscular arms and tentacles surrounded a sharp, parrot-like beak, perfectly suited for grabbing, tearing, or cracking prey. Despite their fearsome potential, it is helpful to imagine their movements as smooth rather than chaotic. A large Ordovician cephalopod would not be racing wildly around the reef. Instead, it would adjust its position by gently pumping water through its siphon, tilting its shell up or down and rotating as needed. From a little distance away, you might see it as a slow, deliberate shape moving through the blue-green water, its tentacles trailing or curling inward as it approached a cluster of smaller animals. Only in the final moments of a strike would it perhaps accelerate, drawing a trilobite or fish-like creature into its grasp. Even that drama played out in the muffled world of the sea would unfold in a series of fluid-controlled motions rather than anything jarring. These early cephalopods were among the first truly large, actively swimming predators to dominate the open ocean. Their rise pushed other animals to adapt, Trilobites and other shelled organisms evolved various defensive strategies, thicker shells, ridges, and spines that made them harder to crush or swallow. Some species adopted more cryptic lifestyles, hiding in crevices of the reef or burrowing deeper into the sediment, exposing only a small portion of their body to the water above. Others may have synchronized behaviors, migratory patterns, molting periods to reduce individual risk, although we see these mostly by analogy with modern ecosystems rather than direct fossil evidence. Alongside the cephalopods, another group of arthropods was quietly gaining prominence in shallow coastal waters, the eurypterids, often called sea scorpions. These animals would reach their greatest sizes later in the Silurian and Devonian, but their origins and early diversification trace back through this time. Early eurypterids likely cruised along the floor of lagoons, estuaries, and shallow seas, using paddle-like limbs to swim and walking legs to explore the bottom. Their bodies were covered by a jointed exoskeleton with a broad head shield, segmented trunk, and a tail that sometimes ended in a spine. In the Ordovician, eurypterids were not yet the giants they would later become, but they were important mid-level predators and scavengers in many shallow environments. They probably fed on smaller arthropods, worms, and soft-bodied animals, using their limbs and claws to manipulate and tear food. In quiet coastal inlets, where sunlight penetrated easily and nutrient-rich sediments accumulated, you might have seen them gliding just above the bottom, stirring up small clouds of sand as they shifted direction. Their presence added another layer to the food web, linking the productivity of coastal shallows to the larger, more open seas beyond. While much of the Ordovician story centers on the ocean, something subtle but significant began to change at the boundary between sea and land. For the first time, simple plants and possibly microbial communities began to colonize damp shorelines and riverbanks. These early pioneers were not forests or even shrubs. They were low, simple organisms hugging the wet ground, lacking complex roots or leaves. Yet their presence started to alter erosion patterns, nutrient flows, and even the atmosphere. Material washed from land into the sea changed in composition, feeding back into marine ecosystems that were already becoming more intricate. In deep time, these modest shoreline plants would eventually give rise to full terrestrial ecosystems. But during the Ordovician, their role was still limited and gentle. Most of the planet's biomass and biodiversity remained in the water. The true drama of life, if we can use that word for such slow processes, still played out beneath the waves on reefs in open shelves and along the slopes of continental margins. But the presence of green on land hinted at a future in which some of the descendants of marine life would not only conquer the seas, but also spread across continents. The Ordovician oceans at their peak were among the richest communities Earth had ever seen up to that point. Reefs stretched for long distances along continental margins. Planktonic organisms filled the upper layers of the water column, forming the base of food chains that supported larger animals. Bottom-dwelling communities included a dense mix of brachiopods, mollusks, echinoderms like starfish and sea lilies, trilobites, and more. Shells, spines, and skeletal fragments constantly rained down onto the seafloor, building thick layers of carbonate sediment over time. From above, if you could hover in a submarine and look down without disturbing anything, you would see a scene layered in depth and complexity. Near the surface, tiny plankton would form invisible clouds, pulsing slowly as currents moved them along. A bit deeper, schools of early jawless fish-like vertebrates might drift and maneuver their simple mouths, filtering particles from the water. Closer to the bottom, the outlines of reef structures would emerge with crinoid arms, waving gently brachiopod shells, opening and closing slightly as they pump water through their feeding apparatus. And larger animals, cephalopods and big arthropods, passing by in the middle distance like quiet moving shadows. For all its richness, though, the Ordovician was not immune to the larger forces that shape Earth's climate and geology. Around 445 million years ago, a series of changes in the planet's orbit and continental arrangement triggered a major glaciation. Ice sheets grew especially over the supercontinent Gondwana, which was then located near the South Pole. As glaciers advanced, they locked away large amounts of water, causing global sea levels to fall. Shallow continental seas, which had been the thriving centers of Ordovician biodiversity, shrank and retreated, leaving once productive habitats exposed or transformed. As sea levels dropped, many reef systems and shelf communities found themselves in trouble. Species adapted to specific depths. Temperatures and conditions could not simply move anywhere they were bound to particular ecological zones. When those zones shifted or disappeared, extinction followed. Cooling waters also changed ocean circulation patterns and may have reduced the availability of key nutrients in some regions, adding further stress. The combined effects of habitat loss, climate change, and altered chemistry led to what we now recognize as the late Ordovician mass extinction, the first of the Big Five major extinction events in Earth's history. Estimates suggest that around 85% of marine species were wiped out during this crisis. Entire communities vanished from the fossil record. Complex reef systems collapsed, leaving behind quieter, simpler seafloors dominated by more resilient survivors. Trilobites, brachiopods, and many other groups lost numerous lineages, though some persisted into later periods. The towering orthoconic cephalopods found their domains reduced, and some of the large forms disappeared forever. It is important to remember, though, that even a mass extinction unfolds on timescales far longer than a human life. From within the world itself, the change would not have felt like a sudden catastrophe. Instead, generation after generation, certain larvae would fail to find suitable habitat, certain adults would find fewer mates or less food, and some lineages would slowly thin out until none remained. The reefs would not crumble in a single day. They would gradually lose their complexity, their delicate partners, their brightest shapes, until only a reduced core of hardy species carried on. Despite the severity of this event, life in the ocean did not end. New reefs would rise in later periods, built by different combinations of corals and other organisms. New predators would evolve to replace those lost, and new defensive strategies would emerge in response. The Ordovician Age of Monsters was both a pinnacle and a bridge connecting the experimental Cambrian world with the... After the Ordovician seas rose, flourished and then dimmed under the weight of ice and extinction, the ocean did what it always does. In deep time, it waited, then slowly began again. In the wake of loss, new lineages crept into the emptied spaces, silent and persistent, reshaping the seafloor and the open water with bodies that had never existed before. The Silurian period marked the first steps of this recovery, a long inhale after the planet's first great marine catastrophe. Coral reefs cautiously rebuilt themselves. Brachiopods and mollusks reclaimed old habitats, and early jawless fishes, small, armored, and cautious, slipped through the shadows. But the story that was assembling beneath the surface was about more than recovery. It was about a new kind of power entering the ocean vertebrates with jaws. By the time we reached the Devonian period, starting around 419 million years ago, that quiet experiment has become a defining feature of marine life. The Devonian is often called the Age of Fishes, and not without reason. In these waters, fishes of all kinds, armored cartilaginous lobe, finned and ray-finned, diversify into forms that fill almost every available niche. Some creep along the bottom, hugging the sediment with heavy bodies. Others slice through the midwater, sleek and efficient. A few will eventually push beyond the shoreline itself, using fleshy, strengthened fins to explore the margins of land. But at the heart of this age, filling its darker currents and ruling its open waters, are the placoderms, the armored fishes. Placoderms were not delicate animals. Their defining feature was a set of thick, bony plates that wrapped around the head and front portion of the body, forming a kind of natural armor. Behind this shield, their bodies could be more flexible, with scales or softer tissue, allowing them to move and steer. In life, a large placoderm would have looked like a fortress, with a tailor blunt, imposing front half capped with solid bone, followed by a more agile rear that provided thrust and balance. Where earlier jawless fishes had simple circular mouths for sucking and filtering, placoderms carried true jaws reinforced by bone. They did not have teeth in the way modern sharks or bony fishes do, but rather sharp, bony plates that could meet and shear. Those plates were living tools, self-sharpening, brutal and efficient. In the dim greenish-blue light of a Devonian sea, the shapes of these animals would emerge slowly from the haze. Imagine hovering above a continental shelf as the sun filters down through a column of water, rich with plankton and drifting particles. At first, you notice only the smaller forms, slender early sharks, darting in short bursts, schools of bony fishes, moving like shifting clouds of silver and grey in the background, the vertical silhouettes of reef structures built by corals, stromatoporoid sponges, and algae, all humming with quiet life. Then, from deeper water, something heavier resolves a broad armored headplate, flanked by powerful pectoral fins, followed by a tapering body that ends in a strong tail. The creature moves with slow confidence, not needing speed unless it chooses to use it. This is Dunkleosteus, the tyrant of these seas. It was one of the largest placoderms, with some estimates placing its length around 6 meters, and its weight well over a ton. Its skull was a mosaic of thick, bony plates, interlocked like a puzzle, each ridge and edge serving both structural and offensive roles. Where other fishes might carry individual teeth, Dunkleosteus's jaws were edged with sharpened bone plates that formed cutting surfaces, like blades set into a vise. As it opened and closed its mouth, those edges would grind slightly against one another, honing their own sharpness with each motion. This self-maintaining system meant that even an older individual would retain a lethal bite. Biomechanical studies suggest that the force it could bring to bear was immense, sufficient to crack through the armored plating of other fishes and to cleave flesh and bone with terrifying efficiency. But in the water, there would be no noise of metal, no crash of impact that you could hear from far away. Only a hush, the rush of displaced water, the muffled snap of jaws closing, the faint thud as a broken shell or plate hit the seafloor. To nearby animals, the presence of Dunkleosteus would register first as a shadow, a broad moving absence of light that passed over rock and reef. Smaller fishes might scatter, veering off into the gloom or seeking the cover of coral branches. Others would freeze, hoping to avoid notice. The great placoderm itself would not need to hurry. It carried time and power with it, a predator built for dominance rather than for panic. Placoderms came in many sizes and shapes beyond the giant apex forms. Some species were small bottom dwellers, feeding on invertebrates or organic debris. Others occupied mid-water roles, preying on smaller fishes and planktonic animals. Their armor varied: too heavy cranial shields for those that risked conflict or predation, lighter plating for more agile hunters that relied on speed. In cross-section, a Devonian water column might reveal multiple layers of placoderm life, tiny near sediment forms, rooting through the substrate, medium-sized swimmers, weaving between coral heads, and farther out, massive silhouettes, cruising the deeper channels like calm moving walls. The rise of these armored fishes did not happen in isolation. At the same time, other vertebrate lineages were branching and experimenting. Among the jawless fishes, some developed heavier head shields and more specialized feeding strategies, though many would eventually be overshadowed by their jawed relatives. Cartilaginous fishes, the ancestors of modern sharks and rays, also began to appear and diversify. Early sharks were in many ways the opposite of placoderms. Their internal skeletons were made of cartilage rather than bone. Their bodies were more flexible and streamlined, and their protective structures came from tooth-like dermal denticles embedded in the skin rather than thick external plates. They traded fortification for agility and endurance. For much of the Devonian, though, placoderms held the upper hand in many marine ecosystems. Their combination of armor and jaw strength gave them a brutal advantage in direct confrontations and in attacking large armored prey. A shark, sleek and swift, might be able to outmaneuver a placoderm in open water, but in a head-on clash near a reef, the heavily armored fish could withstand blows that would cripple a more lightly built animal. This balance created a moody kind of tension in Devonian seas. Two different visions of predatory power moving through the same dark corridors of water. One wrapped in bone, the other wrapped in speed. Below these apex struggles, the rest of the ecosystem continued its quieter work. Devonian reefs reached impressive levels of complexity, especially during the middle of the period. Built by a mix of corals and stromatoporoids, they formed thick mound-like structures and barrier systems that stretched for long distances along continental margins. In the dim spaces between their branches and ridges, smaller fishes, crustaceans and invertebrates found refuge. Crinoids and other echinoderms anchored to high spots, extending feathery arms into passing currents. Brachiopods and bivalves covered horizontal surfaces, opening their shells in slow rhythmic motions as they filtered tiny particles from the water. Each niche from the surge, washed reef crest to the quieter lagoon behind, carried its own community. At night, or in deeper, less lit waters, the mood of these reefs would shift. The bright sun-pierced top layers would fade into the muted glow of whatever light could still penetrate. Small bioluminescent plankton, might flicker faintly in the dark, like drifting dust motes of green or blue. Predatory fishes, placoderms, and early sharks alike could use the low light to approach more closely before their outlines became clear. The rhythm of the reef would slow, but not stop. Many animals would simply switch from vision-based senses to smell touch and the detection of tiny vibrations through the water. The ocean in these hours would feel vast and enclosed. At the same time, a shadowed cathedral of stone and living tissue filled with bodies that moved softly in 3 dimensions. Beyond the reefs, in more open marine settings, different dramas played out. Pelagic fishes, including some placoderms and early bony fishes, patrolled the midwater, following currents and seasonal patterns of plankton blooms. Some grew deep, laterally compressed bodies suited for maneuvering in complex flow. Others developed torpedo-like shapes for long-distance cruising. Jaw structures diversified, crushing plates for breaking shells, needle-like teeth for seizing slippery prey, broad mouths for filtering smaller organisms. In the half-light, these differences appeared primarily in silhouette. A narrow head, here, a broader one, there. Slight changes in fin placement, but their ecological meaning ran deep. Closer to shore, the border between water and land continued to shift. Plants on land which had made tentative forays in the Silurian expanded dramatically in the Devonian. Small leafless stems gave way to more complex vascular plants with branching bodies and early leaves. Over time, primitive forests of tree-like plants began to form their roots, penetrating and stabilizing soils. As vegetation spread, it altered erosion, drawing down atmospheric carbon dioxide and feeding more organic material into rivers and coastal seas. The Devonian landscape, both above and below water, took on a moodier, more layered character. Green shadows along riverbanks, darkened waters, tinged by tannins and sediments, and offshore shelves bathed in nutrient pulses following storms. These land changes fed back into the ocean. Nutrient-rich runoff could stimulate plankton blooms, which in turn fed small fishes and invertebrates, which then supported larger predators. At times, this productivity likely made certain coastal regions especially rich hunting grounds for placoderms and sharks. At other times, excessive nutrient input may have led to oxygen, poor dead zones where decomposition consumed more oxygen than water circulation could replace. In such areas, the seafloor could become a quiet, suffocating plain where only the hardiest or best adapted species could persist. The age of fishes thus contained both abundance and lurking instability. Not all of the Devonians' innovations stayed in the sea. Among the lobe-finned fishes, those with fleshy, muscular fins supported by a single main bone, some lineages gradually developed structures strong enough to push their bodies up in shallow water or even onto muddy banks. These animals did not yet stride onto land as full-time terrestrial creatures, but they blurred the boundary. In stagnant, low-oxygen lagoons or floodplains, being able to gulp air or move between water bodies could be an advantage. From a moody underwater perspective, you might see only the underside of this story. The slow strengthening of fins, the subtle reshaping of skull bones, the quiet rehearsal for life beyond the waves. For the placoderms, though, the Devonian represented their zenith as marine overlords. They had few equals in sheer bite power, and their armored heads made them formidable, even when outmatched in speed. Fossil evidence of partially digested prey and damaged armor in other fishes suggests that confrontations could be violent, at least by the standards of slow motion deep time. In narrow channels or along reef edges, a large Dunkleosteus might ambush other armored fishes, clamping down on head plates and crushing through with a grinding, destructive motion. Yet even here, the overall soundscape would remain subdued impacts, muffled by water vibrations carrying farther than noise. The scene lit more by gradients of green and blue than by any sudden glare. As the Devonian wore on, however, the fortunes of placoderms began to change. Environmental shifts, including fluctuations in sea level climate changes and possible episodes of oceanic anoxia, widespread low oxygen conditions, strained marine ecosystems. Coral stromatoporoid reefs, once vibrant, suffered declines and collapses. Plankton communities changed, altering the base of food webs. At the same time, other vertebrate groups, particularly sharks and bony fishes, continued to refine their designs. Sleeker shapes, more efficient gill systems, better fin control, and more versatile jaws gave them an edge in environments where speed, maneuverability, and metabolic efficiency mattered more than brute armor. By the late Devonian, a series of extinction pulses, sometimes grouped together under the term Late Devonian mass extinction, took a heavy toll on marine life. Reef systems were especially hard hit. Placoderms, despite their previous dominance, did not weather these storms well. Lineage after lineage vanished from the record until eventually the group disappeared entirely. Their great fortress-headed predators left no direct descendants. Their branch of the vertebrate tree simply ended. In the darkened, stressed seas of the late Devonian, heavy armor became less an asset and more a burden. Sharks and bony fishes, more flexible in both body and lifestyle, survived and diversified into the spaces placoderms once held. Over the long run, their designs proved more adaptable to the shifting environments of later Paleozoic and Mesozoic seas. But if we look back specifically at the Devonian at that moody interval, when armored fishes ruled, the impression they leave is powerful. For a significant slice of deep time, the ocean belonged to animals that wore their defenses on the outside, moving through the water like moving citadels. In the early Devonian, armored fishes were everywhere, their silhouettes crossing reefs and open shelves, their bites shaping the evolution of everything around them. In the Middle Devonian, they reached their greatest variety and size, dominating many ecosystems. By the Late Devonian, their world had grown unstable. Reefs faltered, oxygen levels shifted, and younger competitors pressed in from multiple directions. Generation by generation, their numbers declined, their ranges shrank, and their once unquestioned rule faded into memory. The last placoderm to open its jaws and crush another armored skull did so in a sea already filled with the quiet rise of new forms. And yet their legacy remains written into the bones and teeth of later vertebrates. The concept of a jaw-off, hinged bony element used to grasp, cut, and process food, once pioneered and perfected in groups like the placoderms, became a central feature of almost all later fishes and of the tetrapods that would eventually walk on land. The arms race they fueled between armor and offense, between speed and force, continued long after they themselves were gone. Modern sharks, predatory, bony fishes, reptiles, mammals, all of them in a distant sense, carry forward the idea that the Devonian ocean explored so intensely that a vertebrate body can be more than a passive swimmer. It can be an engine of power, leverage, and control in its environment. By the time the armored fishes were beginning their slow rise to power in deeper shelves and offshore reefs, Another kind of hunter was already patrolling the edges of the ancient seas. Not out in the clear blue water, but closer in where rivers met the ocean, where tides carved channels through sand and mud, and where light filtered through silt-filled shallows. These were not fishes at all, but arthropods, joint-legged animals, wrapped in hard exoskeletons, cousins to trilobites, and distant relatives of modern scorpions and horseshoe crabs. We call them Eurypterids, or more dramatically, sea scorpions. Their story stretches from the late Silurian into the Devonian, weaving through lagoons, estuaries, tidal flats, and protected coastal bays. In these environments where water was often murky, salinity shifted with tides and floods, and the seafloor was a soft mix of mud and sand, Eurypterids rose to the top of the food web. While giant orthocone cephalopods dominated some offshore settings, and placoderm fishes ruled deeper reefs, Eurypterids quietly claimed the borderlands, those in-between places where land and sea blurred into one another. In these liminal zones, they became the shadows that smaller creatures learned to fear. Or, if you imagine a late Silurian shoreline, do not picture a bright sandy beach beneath a clear sky. Instead, think of braided river mouths spilling into broad, shallow inlets. Low early plants hug the banks in scattered patches, their simple stems reaching only a short distance above the ground. There are no forests yet, just hints of green pressed close to damp soil. The air is heavy with moisture and rich in carbon dioxide, and the tide cycles expose wide mudflats, then cover them again. In the shallow water just offshore, visibility is poor currents suspend fine sediment into the water column, turning everything a muted brownish green. Here, Eurypterids flourish. Their bodies are generally elongated and segmented with a broad head shield at the front and a tapering abdomen ending in a pointed or paddle-shaped tail. Some are small, only a few centimeters long, gliding over the substrate in search of worms and tiny crustaceans. Others, especially in later Silurian and Devonian times, reach far more impressive sizes lengths, well over 1 meter, and in some species beyond 2.5 meters. To creatures sharing those waters, a giant Eurypterid would have been a looming presence longer than a human is tall armored from front to back, with grasping appendages at the front and broad paddles at the rear for swimming. Despite their nickname, not all Eurypterids were strictly marine. Many species appear to have been comfortable in brackish and even fully freshwater environments, moving freely between coastal seas, estuaries, and inland lakes. This versatility helped them colonize a wide range of habitats and made them persistent features of Paleozoic shorelines. In the dim, shifting light of these waters, their silhouettes would have been one of the most recognizable shapes: a flattened, elongated body, jointed legs, moving in a steady rhythm along the bottom, and sometimes a pair of oar-like limbs beating in slow strokes as they swam. Eurypterids hunted. It helps to picture their body plan in a bit more detail. At the front, they carried a pair of chelicera's more pincer-like mouthparts, used to manipulate and tear food. Behind these were several pairs of walking legs, some tipped with spines or claws that could grasp or pin down prey. Toward the rear of the body, one or more pairs of limbs were modified into broad paddles. These paddles were not just for speed. They gave Eurypterids fine control over their position in the water, allowing them to rise slightly above the bottom or glide forward in short, silent bursts. In a shallow lagoon, just deep enough that light still reached the sediment, but murky enough that details blurred at a short distance. A hunting eurypterid would blend easily into the background. Its dark exoskeleton matched the tones of mud and organic debris, and its movements were measured rather than frantic. Jawless fishes, small, early, bony fishes, and invertebrates like worms and smaller arthropods moved through the same space, searching for food among plant fragments and microbial films. To them, the danger was not a sudden dramatic attack from afar, but the slow approach of something that at first looked like just another patch of shadow. Eurypterids could hunt in different ways, depending on the species and setting. Some likely prowled the bottom, using their walking legs to feel along the sediment, ready to seize anything they disturbed. Others may have taken advantage of their swimming paddles to rise slightly into the water column, then drop or lunge downward onto unsuspecting prey. In both cases, their success depended less on raw speed and more on positioning and timing. They were ambush predators, attuned to the subtle cues of movement and vibration in the water, sensitive to the stirring of a fin or the wriggle of a buried worm. The connection between land and shallow sea gave eurypterids a uniquely dynamic stage. The chemistry and clarity of their waters changed with seasons and storms. Salinity could fluctuate as freshwater pulses mixed with marine tides. Oxygen levels might drop in stagnant backwaters, then recover when currents returned. Eurypterids adapted to a range of salinities, and oxygen conditions could endure these shifts better than many of their potential competitors. Their hard exoskeletons shielded them from some environmental stressors, and their ability to move between different subhabitats gave them options when conditions turned unfavorable. As jawed fishes continued to advance offshore and in deeper waters, the coastal realm remained for a time a kind of arthropod citadel. Here, eurypterids sat high in the food chain, with only a few serious threats of their own size. In quieter back bays, a large sea scorpion might be the undisputed apex predator, its presence shaping the behavior and distribution of everything beneath it. Small fishes avoided open areas when these animals were active. Burrowing invertebrates might shift feeding times or depths in response to predation pressure. Even other eurypterids competing for space and mates would have had to navigate a social world defined by displays, encounters, and occasional clashes between armored bodies. Over millions of years, eurypterid diversity waxed and waned. Some lineages adapted to more open marine conditions, others to freshwater lakes and rivers. Body plans shifted. Some forms developed broader paddles for more efficient swimming. Others emphasized walking limbs for benthic life. Eyes evolved in size and placement, reflecting different balances between visual hunting and other sensory strategies. Yet through all this variation, one theme persisted in the murky, changing shallows. These arthropods remained among the most imposing and capable predators. As with so many groups in deep time, their reign did not last forever. Later in the Palaeozoic, particularly by the Carboniferous and Permian eurypterids, declined and eventually disappeared. Changes in climate, sea levels, and competition from increasingly sophisticated vertebrate predators likely all played roles. Amphibious and fully terrestrial vertebrates, along with more advanced fishes and sharks, entered and reshaped many of the habitats eurypterids once dominated. The same shifting margins between land and water that had once favored sea scorpions now offered opportunities to newcomers with internal skeletons and lungs. By the time we reached the Permian, The long story you have been following through these ancient oceans feels for a moment almost stable. Life has clawed its way back from earlier extinctions, rebuilt reefs after devastation, and spread across both land and sea in forms far more complex than anything the planet had seen in the Cambrian or Devonian. On the continents, forests and seed-bearing plants cover vast areas, and vertebrates, no longer just cautious tetrapods, at the water's edge, have established themselves as full terrestrial inhabitants. In the oceans, fish sharks, mollusks, brachiopods, echinoderms, and countless other groups form dense tiered ecosystems from shallow shelves down into deeper basins. Looking at a snapshot of Earth just before the end of the Permian, you might think the planet had finally settled into a kind of long-term equilibrium. The Permian seas themselves are different from the Devonian waters we visited earlier. The great coral stromatoporoid reefs of the Devonian did not simply reappear instead. New reef communities developed, built at various times by different combinations of sponges, algae and corals. In warm, shallow epicontinental seas, broad sunlit stretches of water flooding low-lying continental interiors, marine life reached impressive diversity. Brachiopods carpeted the seafloor in some regions, while bivalves, gastropods, and ammonoids filled other niches. Crinoids, those feather-armed relatives of starfish, rose on stalks or floated freely filtering food from the currents. Sharks and bony fishes, now inheritors of the mantle once worn by placoderms, patrolled above and between these structures with a confidence earned through millions of years of evolutionary refinement. On land, the picture was equally rich. The continents of the late Palaeozoic had assembled into the supercontinent Pangaea, a vast interconnected landmass spanning from pole to pole. Its interior held broad deserts and seasonal climates, while its margins hosted forests, river systems, and coastal wetlands. Seed plants, including early conifers and other gymnosperms, had spread widely better adapted than their spore-bearing predecessors to drier interiors and more varied conditions. Among the vertebrates were diverse synapsids, sometimes casually called mammal-like reptiles, such as Dimetrodon, like sail-backed predators, and more advanced therapsids with differentiated teeth and more upright postures. Amphibians and reptile lineages varied in size and form, some tied closely to water, others ranging farther inland. All of this complexity meant that by the late Permian Earth was not just alive, it was networked. Nutrients cycled through forest floors, rivers, coastal wetlands, and shallow seas in loops far more intricate than anything in earlier eras. Atmospheric gases, oxygen, carbon dioxide, water vapor were influenced by interactions across that entire web respiration. In soils, photosynthesis in forests, oceanic plankton, blooms, volcanic emissions, and weathering of rocks. The planet had become a single breathing system, with land and sea deeply entwined. And then, around 252 million years ago, something broke. In what is now Siberia, an enormous province of volcanic rock known as the Siberian Traps began to form as massive eruptions tore through the crust. These were not brief explosive events, like a single modern volcano. They were sustained outpourings of basaltic lava, over hundreds of thousands perhaps, up to a couple of million years. Layer upon layer of molten rock flooded across vast areas, sometimes releasing flows hundreds of meters thick. As magma interacted with carbon-rich sediments in the subsurface, enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and other gases, including methane and sulfur compounds, were injected into the atmosphere. The cumulative effect was a profound and prolonged perturbation of the climate system. Carbon dioxide, a potent greenhouse gas, trapped more of the sun's heat, driving a global rise in temperature. In the ocean's warmer surface, waters change circulation patterns and reduce the amount of oxygen that could dissolve in the water. On land, temperature extremes and shifting rainfall patterns stressed plant communities and soils. Acidifying rains enriched with volcanic gases fell over forests and mountains, enhancing weathering, but also damaging vegetation. As the climate warmed, the oceans began to feel the consequences more and more deeply. Warmer water holds less dissolved oxygen than cooler water, all else being equal. With surface layers heating up vertical mixing that normally brings oxygenated water down and nutrient-rich water up could weaken. In certain basins and along some continental margins, this stratification created a deadly combination: oxygen-poor bottom waters, overlain by warmer, more stable surface layers. Nutrients from land and decaying biomass fueled high productivity near the surface. But when that organic material sank and decomposed, it further consumed what little oxygen remained below. As conditions shift, acidity creeping upward, oxygen declining in surrounding waters, that breathing becomes strained. Corals and other framework builders may bleach or die in greater numbers. Their symbiotic partnerships with microbes and algae disrupted. New skeletal material accumulates more slowly, while chemical dissolution and physical erosion continue. The delicate balance that keeps the reef growing faster than it crumbles tilts the other way. In the fossil record, these changes eventually appear as a collapse in reef abundance and diversity. Entire reef provinces go quiet, leaving behind intervals dominated by simpler, less structured communities. Farther out on the continental shelves, brachiopod beds, echinoderm gardens and other dense assemblages of invertebrates face similar challenges. Many of these organisms rely on relatively well-oxygenated stable conditions and on a certain range of carbonate saturation states for shell building. When oxygen declines, some can retreat into a state of reduced activity for a while, but prolonged anoxia is usually incompatible with their physiology. If acidification weakens their shells, they become more vulnerable to both environmental stress and predation. In layer after layer of late Permian sediment, the diversity and abundance of these groups dwindle, until in many places they disappear altogether. The vertebrates of the sea fare no better. Many fish and marine reptiles, where present, are tied to specific temperature and oxygen ranges. Rising temperatures can increase metabolic demands, requiring more oxygen at the very moment when less is available. In oxygen, poor conditions, larger, more active animals often suffer first as their needs outstrip supply. Some may attempt to migrate to cooler or better oxygenated waters, but when stress is global rather than regional, there are fewer refugees to find. The fossil record bears witness to this pattern, as whole groups of fishes, sharks, and other vertebrates drop sharply in diversity across the Permian-Triassic boundary. In the deep ocean, anoxia can become not just a seasonal or regional feature, but a near-permanent state in some basins. Under extreme conditions, stagnant oxygen-free bottom waters can accumulate not only organic matter, but also certain gases, like hydrogen sulfide, produced by sulfator, reducing bacteria. If such water masses rise to shallower depths, or even reach the surface in some areas, they can create zones that are poisonous to most complex life. Some hypotheses for the Great Dying involve such oxinic sulfideric conditions spreading over broad areas of the ocean, contributing to the collapse of marine ecosystems. When researchers estimate the toll of the Permian-Triassic extinction, the numbers are stark. It is thought that over 90 of marine species were lost, along with a very high proportion of terrestrial species. Entire clades that had persisted for hundreds of millions of years, trilobites for example, which had survived previous crises from the Cambrian onward, finally disappeared. Many types of corals, brachiopods, crinoids, and other invertebrates were either pushed to the brink or eliminated. On land, diverse synapsid groups and other vertebrates saw massive attrition. The biosphere, which had once filled many ecological roles with redundancy, suddenly found itself with vast empty spaces in its networks. From inside the event, of course, there was no single day when 90 of species died. The Great Dying unfolded over tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of years, with possible shorter spikes of especially acute stress layered into the longer trend. A forest might decline gradually over generations, as saplings failed more often than they succeeded, as disease and heat took a rising toll. A reef might lose key framework builders, first then see its dependent fish and invertebrate species fade away, leaving behind only hardy generalists. For individual organisms, the catastrophe consisted of a lifetime spent in a world where conditions got a little worse. Each decade, hotter summers, more erratic rains, poorer water quality, fewer places to hide or feed. By the time the extinction had run its full course, the Earth was transformed. Many of the characteristic late Paleozoic ecosystems were gone. The ornate, highly specialized communities of the Permian had been pruned back to a core of survivor species and lineages that by luck or by particular adaptations made it through the bottleneck. Some may have found refuge in cooler, higher latitude regions, others in deeper or more isolated basins that escaped the worst anoxia, still others in microhabitats that buffered them from the most extreme swings. These surviving pockets of life, scattered across a wounded planet, became the seeds from which the next age would grow. If you could look at the oceans in the immediate aftermath, you would not see a world devoid of motion. Water would still flow. Currents would still circle the globe. Waves would still break on shores, and yet recovery did come. In the Triassic, new kinds of corals and other reef builders would slowly re-establish complex structures in some seas. New groups of fishes and marine reptiles would evolve and diversify, filling niches left vacant by the losses. On land, the vertebrate fauna would reorganize around survivors and newcomers, including early archosaurs and other lineages that would eventually give rise to dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and much later, birds and mammals. The world that emerged was not a simple replay of what had been lost. It was a new arrangement built atop the thin, resilient layer of species that had made it through the Great Dying. If you are listening to this now, somewhere in your own quiet room, it is worth pausing for a breath. The oxygen you draw in owes its very existence to the earliest microbial architects of the sea. The bones that hold you up belong to a lineage that learned to walk in Devonian swamps. The complex ecosystems that feed and shelter you are shaped by countless evolutionary experiments that happened long before dinosaurs and that nearly ended in the Permian. Our planet has been more than once very close to becoming a silent place again. The fact that it did not, that life found ways through those narrow corridors, is the only reason any of us are here to tell these stories. When you step back from each of these eras, the microbial dawn, the alien gardens, the explosions and extinction sit, can be tempting to see them as disconnected stories. Little self-contained worlds, each with its own monsters and its own rules, separated from us by unimaginable time. But if you let all of those chapters sit together for a moment, something different starts to appear. You begin to feel not just the differences between them, but the long, unbroken thread that runs through them all. That same thread runs through you right now, wherever you happen to be listening. The earliest part of that thread began in oceans that bore almost no resemblance to the seas we know. The sky was hostile, the water thick with dissolved metals and gases, and the land around it mostly bare rock. There were no fish, no coralsness, no forests, no shells, just simple cells, finding ways to harvest energy and hold themselves together. Out of that chemical quiet came cyanobacteria and other microbes that discovered photosynthesis, and with it the slow, patient release of oxygen into water and air. They built stromatolites and matte, tiny layered worlds that turn light into structure, and structure into the possibility of every complex life form that would come later. Much later, when the Ediacaran seas spread out under a newly oxygenated sky, that same thread expressed itself as something entirely new. On the seafloor, soft-bodied organisms like Dickinsonia and Charnia formed a quilt of unfamiliar shapes. There were no jaws and no eyes, just layered fronds and ovals absorbing what they needed from water and microbial mats. It was a world without hunting, where being large meant spreading across the sediment, not chasing anything through it. For a time, that experiment was enough. It was the pinnacle of complexity on Earth. But evolution never stays still for long, and the conditions that made that quiet garden possible also prepared the stage for its replacement. With the Cambrian came the first major turning of the page. Eyes appeared armor-hardened, and the ocean filled with creatures that could see and pursue. Trilobites crawled and swam their crystal lenses, catching light from many directions. Strange animals like hallucigenia walked on fleshy legs with spines guarding their backs, while predators, like Anomalocaris, glided above with lobed bodies and grasping appendages. What had been a world of mostly passive absorption became one of encounters of approach and escape, of attack and defense. The thread of life did not break here. It simply twisted into new shapes, turning awareness into a tool and conflict into a driver of diversity. The Ordovician and Devonian took that premise and built upon it layer by layer. Reefs grew higher and more complex. Cephalopods extended their shells and their reach, becoming soft-bodied mines in long, tapering fortresses of calcium carbonate. Eurypterids slipped along the margins of seas and estuaries, sea scorpions turning murky shallows into their hunting grounds. Placoderms rose as armored fish overlords their bony plates, and guillotine jaws making the open waters of the Devonian feel heavy with power. Above them, forests took root, darkening rivers, and changing the chemistry that eventually fed back into the sea. In backwaters and swamps, lobe-finned fishes and early tetrapods tested land, carrying gills and fins toward lungs and limbs. It was a long crescendo, a building complexity in which the same basic ingredients, water, carbon, sunlight, and time, were combined and recombined into ever more intricate forms. Then the Permian brought something like a culmination, the supercontinent Pangaea assembled, and with it, large-scale climates and ecosystems that wrap together much of the planet's surface. Life, both in the seas and on land, reached a kind of sprawling maturity. Synapsids prowled deserts and forests, seed plants spread across uplands and coastal plains. In the oceans, fishes, invertebrates, and reef communities occupied an astonishing range of roles. If you could have paused the planet just before the Great Dying and looked at its living systems, you might have thought this is what a stable, fully developed Earth looks like. All of this has unfolded in oceans that, from our limited human vantage point, can look changeless. Stand on any shore today, a beach on the Indian Ocean, a rocky coast on the Atlantic, a quiet bay on the Pacific, and the waves you see feel timeless. They break and reform, break and reform in patterns that echo back beyond written history. But beneath their surface, the water carries memories written in chemistry, in sediments, and in the genes of the organisms that live there. Microbes today still build stromatolite like structures in a few places. Jellyfish, corals, arthropods, mollusks, fishes and mammals all embody variations on themes. First explored in the deep past you have just walked through, the sea has changed profoundly and repeatedly, and yet it is still the same continuous body that lapped at Precambrian shores. When we talk about mass extinctions, there is always a temptation to treat them as distant, almost abstract events. Numbers like 90% of marine species sound huge, but impersonal. One of the quiet purposes of a journey like this is to give those numbers texture. For a lineage that survived Snowball Earth, the Cambrian arms race, and earlier crises to finally reach its endpoint. For ancient oceans that were once full of movement and colour, to become for a while empty of almost everything but microbes and a handful of hardy survivors. This does not mean that another great dying is inevitable, or that we stand in the same situation as the late Permian. The drivers and details are different. Our agency and awareness are new variables in the system. The rocks tell us that Earth will continue in one form or another, regardless. The open question is always which threads of life will make it through, and what kind of world they will awaken into on the other side. For now, though, this journey has simply been about seeing. Seeing the alien beauty of Ediacaran match the strange symmetry of hallucigenia, the polished eyes of trilobites, the quiet menace of Anomalocaris, the heavy grace of Dunkleosteus, the shadows of sea scorpions in brown estuaries, the dark rivers feeding Devonian seas, the first clumsy steps of tetrapods onto land, and the long, slow dimming of the Permian Ocean. You do not have to remember every name or every date. If what stays with you is just a feeling that our world has been many worlds, and that the one we know sits atop a vast layered history, then this chapter has done its work. As you come back to your own time, to whatever room or place you are in, let that feeling settle gently rather than urgently. You are part of a planet that has been nearly frozen solid and nearly boiled, that has seen skies without oxygen and forests without flowers, seas without fish and shores without life. You are also part of a moment when those long histories are more visible to us than ever before, when we can read their traces in stone and molecule and light. There is something quietly grounding in that, an awareness that we are late arrivals in a very old story, but not separate from it. If you've stayed with this journey into Earth's oldest oceans, thank you for letting these deep time stories share a little space in your day. If you'd like more quiet trips into the past like this, you can gently tap like and subscribe. It helps this kind of calm, long-form content find the people who might need it. And before you drift off or move on, feel free to leave a comment with where you're watching from and the time on your clock right now. Good night, and keep looking up.